There's a woman whose face could turn you to stone, and yet, for thousands of years, we've been unable to look away. Her name echoes through history like a curse whispered in the dark: Medusa. But here's what they don't tell you in the myths, what gets lost in the translations, buried beneath centuries of storytelling and patriarchal rewrites. Medusa wasn't always a monster. She was a victim. And the real horror of her story isn't what she became, it's what was done to her to make her that way. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of one of mythology's most misunderstood figures. We're going to talk about transformation, about trauma, about how society creates monsters and then punishes them for existing. Because Medusa's story isn't just ancient history, it's happening right now, all around us, every single day. And by the time we're done here, you'll never see her the same way again. Let's start with what you think you know. A woman with snakes for hair, a gaze that turns men to stone, a monster lurking in a cave waiting to be slain by a hero. Perseus, the brave warrior, cuts off her head and saves the day. Roll credits. But that's not the whole story. That's not even half of it. That's the version they wanted you to hear, the sanitized, simplified, hero-worshipping version that makes you feel good about the violence. But if you dig deeper, if you actually read the ancient texts, if you listen to what's being said between the lines, a very different story emerges. A story about power, about violation, about what happens when the powerless are punished for the crimes of the powerful. In the earliest versions of the myth, Medusa wasn't born a monster. She was beautiful, stunningly, dangerously beautiful. She was a priestess in the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and virgin purity. Medusa had taken a vow of chastity, dedicating her life to serving the goddess. And then Poseidon, god of the seas, saw her, and he wanted her. Now, when a god wants something in Greek mythology, consent isn't usually part of the equation. Poseidon didn't ask, he took. Right there in Athena's temple, on sacred ground, he violated her. Pause for a moment. Think about what that means. Medusa did nothing wrong. She was in a holy place, fulfilling her duties, living her life. And a god, someone infinitely more powerful than her, someone she couldn't fight, couldn't escape, committed an act of violence against her. And then, here's where the story gets truly horrifying. Athena punished her for it, not Poseidon. Him she couldn't touch. He was a god, her equal in power, her uncle in the divine family tree. No, Athena punished Medusa. She transformed her beautiful priestess into a monster, gave her snakes for hair, made her face so horrifying that anyone who looked at her would turn to stone. She exiled her to a remote island, cut her off from humanity, from help, from any chance at redemption or justice. Think about the cruelty of that for a second. Medusa was assaulted and then punished for being assaulted. She became the monster because she was the victim. And we've been telling this story for thousands of years like it's normal, like it makes sense, like she somehow deserved what happened to her. But here's where it gets interesting, where the myth starts to reveal something deeper about human nature and how we process trauma. Some scholars argue that Athena's transformation wasn't purely a punishment, it was also a protection. By making Medusa's gaze lethal, Athena gave her a weapon. No man could ever touch her again. No man could even look at her without consequences. In a world where she was utterly powerless, she became the most powerful thing imaginable, untouchable, deadly, autonomous in a way that few women in ancient Greece ever were. Was it a curse or was it a gift? Maybe it was both. Maybe that's the point. Trauma transforms us. It has to. We can't go through something that shattering and remain the same. The question is, what do we become? Do we turn inward, isolate ourselves, become so defended that no one can reach us? Or do we find a way to transmute that pain into something else, something that serves us, protects us, gives us back some measure of control? Medusa retreated to her island. She lived in darkness, surrounded by the stone statues of men who had tried to kill her, tried to claim her head as a trophy. Because that's the thing about becoming powerful when you're supposed to be powerless. It makes you a target. It makes you something that needs to be destroyed. And so the heroes came. One after another, they came to prove themselves, to win glory, to take her head and mount it on a shield. And one by one, they turned to stone. Until Perseus.
Perseus had something the others didn't. He had help from the gods. Athena herself gave him a polished shield, told him to look at Medusa's reflection instead of her face. Hermes gave him winged sandals and a sword sharp enough to cut through anything. He had divine intervention on his side, because apparently, even when you're a monster created by the gods' own cruelty, you're not allowed to survive. The narrative demands your death. The hero's journey requires a villain, and Medusa, the woman who had already lost everything, was chosen for that role. Perseus found her sleeping. He crept into her lair while she was vulnerable, while her eyes were closed, while she couldn't defend herself, and he cut off her head. There's something darkly ironic about that, isn't there? She was assaulted while serving in a temple, and she was killed while sleeping in her own home. Both times she was caught unawares, unable to consent, unable to fight back. The pattern repeats. The violence echoes. But even in death, Medusa remained powerful. Her severed head retained its ability to turn things to stone. Perseus used it as a weapon, wielded her trauma, her transformation, her pain as a tool for his own glory. He turned his enemies to stone with her gaze. He used her to win battles, to claim kingdoms, to secure his legend. Even in death, she wasn't allowed to rest. Her body became an instrument of someone else's will. And here's what happened next, what they don't always tell you in the children's versions of the myth. When Perseus cut off Medusa's head, from her neck sprang two beings, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword. Her children, the offspring of Poseidon's violence, trapped inside her body all this time, born only in her death. Even her ending was stolen from her. Even her blood, her final moments, belonged to someone else's story. The ancient Greeks wore images of Medusa's face on their armor, on their shields, on the walls of their cities. The Gorgonion, they called it, a protective symbol, apotropaic magic, meant to ward off evil. They believed that her face, the face of a woman destroyed and transformed by violence, could protect them. There's a psychology to that worth examining. We take the image of what we fear most, what disturbs us most deeply, and we put it on display. We say, look, we've conquered this, we've tamed it, we wear it like a badge. But what are we really doing? Are we protecting ourselves from external threats, or are we trying to protect ourselves from the uncomfortable truth that we might be the threat, that we might be complicit in creating the monsters we claim to fear? Fast forward a few thousand years, the Renaissance. Artists are rediscovering classical mythology, reimagining it through new cultural lenses, and Medusa becomes a subject of fascination. Caravaggio paints her, captures the moment of her beheading, her face frozen in shock and pain, snakes writhing around her head, blood still fresh. Benvenuto Cellini sculpts Perseus holding her severed head, and tourists still flock to Florence to see it, to take photos with it, to stand beneath the image of a woman's violent death and smile. There's something deeply troubling about that, about how we aestheticize violence, especially violence against women, how we turn it into art, into culture, into something beautiful to admire. But then, in more recent years, something shifts. Medusa starts to be reclaimed. Feminist scholars begin to read her story differently, not as a cautionary tale about female monstrosity, but as a story about survival, about the cost of being a woman in a world that sees you as either an object to possess or a threat to destroy. Medusa becomes a symbol of resistance. Her face appears on posters, on t-shirts, in art installations that challenge rape culture, that demand justice for survivors. The monster becomes the martyr. The villain becomes the hero. In 2008, a sculpture appeared in a New York courthouse, Medusa, but not as you've seen her before. This Medusa was standing tall, holding the severed head of Perseus. The roles reversed, the victim claiming her power back, the monster slaying the hero. It caused controversy, of course. People were outraged. How dare we celebrate violence against men? How dare we reverse the sacred narrative? But that's exactly the point, isn't it? We've been celebrating violence against women for thousands of years and calling it heroism. When the story flips, when the powerless claim power, suddenly everyone notices the violence. Suddenly everyone has moral concerns.
Here's what Medusa's story teaches us, what it's been trying to teach us all along. Monsters are made, not born. Every villain has an origin story, and if you trace it back far enough, you'll usually find an act of violence, an abuse of power, a moment when someone who should have been protected was instead destroyed. We create the things we fear. We traumatize, we ostracize, we punish, and then we act surprised when people become defensive, when they lash out, when they turn into something we can no longer recognize, and then we kill them for it. We call it justice, we call it heroism. We build monuments to their deaths, and we sleep soundly, convinced we've made the world safer. But have we? Or have we just perpetuated a cycle? Violence answered with violence, trauma begetting trauma. Generation after generation, century after century, the same story playing out with different names and faces, but the same fundamental structure. Someone is hurt. Someone becomes dangerous because they were hurt. Someone decides they're too dangerous to live. Someone kills them. Someone is celebrated for the killing. The pattern holds. And here's what's haunting about Medusa specifically, why her story resonates so powerfully in our current moment. She couldn't win. There was no path to redemption for her, no way to undo what had been done, no way to become human again. She was transformed against her will and then punished for that transformation. She was given power, but only the kind of power that isolated her, that made her impossible to love, impossible to approach. She was made lethal and then killed for being lethal. The trap was perfect. The tragedy was inevitable. How many people do you know who are living some version of Medusa's story right now? How many people have been hurt so badly that they've built walls around themselves, made themselves hard to reach, hard to love, prickly and defensive because it's the only way they know how to survive? How many people have been punished not for what they did, but for what was done to them? How many people have been transformed by trauma and then rejected for being transformed? How many people are exiled on their own islands, surrounded by the stone remains of everyone who tried to fix them, save them, or destroy them? We talk about trauma like it's something that happens to you and then ends, but trauma doesn't end. It lives in your body. It changes how you see the world, how you trust people, how you move through space. It gives you a kind of terrible knowledge that people who haven't experienced it don't have. You can see the darkness in others because you've been in the dark yourself. You can sense danger before it arrives because danger has already found you once. You develop instincts, defense mechanisms, ways of protecting yourself that might look like hostility to people who don't understand. Your gaze becomes something that keeps people at a distance, not because you want to be alone, but because being alone is safer than being hurt again. That's Medusa. That's what she represents. The woman who was harmed and then blamed. The woman who built defenses and was called a monster for having them. The woman who said never again, who made herself dangerous so she couldn't be a victim anymore and was killed for it. Her story is a mirror. It shows us what we do to survivors. It shows us how we mythologize violence. It shows us the lies we tell ourselves about heroes and monsters, about who deserves protection and who deserves destruction. But let's go deeper. Let's talk about the snakes. Because in Greek mythology, symbols matter. Everything means something, and snakes are deeply, profoundly significant. They represent transformation, rebirth, healing. The medical symbol, the rod of Asclepius, has a snake wrapped around it. Snakes shed their skin. They emerge new. In many ancient cultures, they were sacred, associated with female power, with fertility, with the earth itself. So when Athena gave Medusa snakes for hair, was it really just a curse, or was it something else? A crown of transformation, a symbol of her fundamental change, her death and rebirth into something new. The snakes weren't there to make her ugly. They were there to mark her as someone who had passed through fire and emerged on the other side. Someone who had shed her old skin and could never go back. There's a version of this story where Medusa isn't the villain, where she's the wise woman, the crone, the keeper of dangerous knowledge, where men turn to stone not because she's cursed, but because they can't handle what she knows, what she's seen, what she's survived. They turn to stone because facing her means facing uncomfortable truths about power, about violence, about what men do to women when no one is watching. They turn to stone because it's easier to freeze, to shut down, to become immovable and hard than it is to sit with that knowledge and let it change you. What if Medusa's gaze isn't a weapon? What if it's a test? What if the men who could look at her and not turn to stone were the ones who could acknowledge what had been done to her, who could see her humanity beneath the monstrosity, who could meet her pain with compassion instead of fear? But in the myth, no such man exists. Every man who sees her either wants to kill her or becomes stone. There's no third option. No one can simply see her, acknowledge her, and walk away. She exists only as a threat to be neutralized or a trophy to be claimed. Think about what that says about how we see women who've been traumatized. We either try to fix them, save them, change them back into what they were before, or we avoid them entirely, write them off as damaged, too difficult, too complicated. We don't let them simply be. We don't let them exist in their transformation. We demand that they either heal in ways that make us comfortable or disappear. And if they refuse both options, if they stay visible in their pain, if they make us uncomfortable, we call them monsters. Medusa refused to disappear. She stayed. She existed. She survived for a time in her exile. She lived with what had been done to her. And that, more than anything, is why she had to die in the myth. Not because she was evil, but because she was a reminder. A living testament to divine cruelty, to injustice, to the fact that sometimes terrible things happen to innocent people and there's no redemption arc, no silver lining, no lesson that makes it okay. Sometimes people are just hurt, and then they have to live with it, and the world is worse because of what was done to them. That's an uncomfortable truth. Myths aren't supposed to contain uncomfortable truths. They're supposed to teach us lessons, give us heroes to admire, make the world make sense. So, Medusa had to go. The reminder had to be silenced. But you can't kill an idea. You can't kill a symbol. You can cut off her head, but she keeps coming back. Every generation rediscovers her. Every culture reimagines her. She appears in movies, in books, in poetry, in feminist theory, in psychology, in art. She's in the Versace logo, for God's sake. Even capitalism has tried to claim her, to sand down her edges and make her marketable. But she resists. There's something in her story that refuses to be domesticated, refuses to be simplified, something that keeps reaching through the centuries, grabbing us by the throat and saying, "Look at me. Really look at me. See what they did. See what I became. See what you do to your monsters." And here's where we need to talk about Perseus, because he's not innocent in this either. He's always framed as the hero, but let's examine what he actually does. He's sent to kill Medusa by a king who wants to marry his mother and sees Perseus as an obstacle. So the king sends him on what's supposed to be a suicide mission. Kill the Gorgon, bring me her head, expecting him to die in the attempt. Perseus is a pawn. He's being manipulated. But instead of questioning the mission, instead of asking why he needs to kill this woman, what she actually did to deserve death, he just goes. He accepts the narrative. She's a monster, monsters must be slain. Heroes slay monsters. I will be a hero. He never asks what made her a monster. He never considers her story. To him, she's just an obstacle, a challenge, a thing to be overcome on his way to glory. And that's the insidious part. That's how the cycle perpetuates. People don't set out to do evil, they just accept the stories they're told. They just follow the script. They just do what everyone agrees is right, what tradition demands, what society expects. And in doing so, they commit atrocities. They behead women who were already victims. They use those severed heads as weapons. They get statues built in their honor. The real horror of Medusa's story isn't supernatural, it's human. It's how we treat the wounded. It's how we punish strength in people we think should be weak. It's how we turn victims into villains and then feel righteous about their destruction. It's how we immortalize that destruction, celebrate it, teach it to our children as a tale of heroism. But something is changing. Slowly, gradually, the narrative is shifting. More people are questioning the heroes. More people are asking, wait, who actually was the monster here? More people are recognizing themselves in Medusa, in her isolation, in her transformation, in her rage. More people are saying, yes, I too was hurt and changed by it, and I refuse to be ashamed of what I had to become to survive. I refuse to let you turn me back into something soft and easy to destroy. I refuse to die quietly so you can feel like a hero. There's power in that. There's revolution in that. When enough people start identifying with the monster instead of the hero, the whole story breaks down. When enough people say, actually, Medusa was right to defend herself. Actually, she deserved to live. Actually, she was more complex than good or evil, victim or villain. When enough people refuse the binary, the myth can't hold. It fractures. And in those fractures, new stories can grow. So here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about a woman with snakes for hair, still trying to understand her, still seeing ourselves in her, still fighting about what she means, whose side we should be on, whether she's a cautionary tale or an inspiration. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the power of myth isn't in giving us answers. Maybe it's in asking questions that don't have easy answers. Questions like, what do we owe to people who've been hurt? What do we do when the victim becomes dangerous? How do we break cycles of violence without committing more violence? How do we see the humanity in people who've been dehumanized, even by their own survival strategies? These aren't abstract questions. They're playing out right now, in courtrooms and therapy offices and relationships and social movements. Every time a survivor speaks up and is asked what they did to provoke their assault, every time someone who's built walls to protect themselves is called cold or difficult, every time trauma is treated as a character flaw instead of an injury, every time we expect people to heal quietly, invisibly, in ways that don't make us uncomfortable, every time we demand that the wounded prove they deserve care by being perfectly sympathetic, perfectly grateful, perfectly unthreatening, we're repeating Medusa's story. We're creating new Gorgons and then acting shocked when they bite. The thing is, we could choose differently. We could look at Medusa and see not a monster to be slain, but a woman who needed help, who needed justice, who needed someone to say, what happened to you was wrong, and I'm sorry, and you didn't deserve it, and your anger makes sense, and your fear makes sense, and your defenses make sense, and you're not a monster, you're a survivor. We could choose to see the humanity in people who've been transformed by pain. We could choose to sit with the discomfort of their stories instead of turning away or demanding they change to make us feel better. But that would require us to look in the mirror. It would require us to acknowledge our role in creating monsters. It would require us to admit that sometimes the heroes in our stories are actually the villains. It would require us to give up the simple narratives, the clean divisions between good and evil, the reassuring myths that tell us violence can be righteous, that some people are beyond redemption, that killing is sometimes necessary and noble. It would require us to face Medusa's gaze and not turn to stone, to let it change us, to let it shatter our certainties and force us to see the world differently. And that's terrifying, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand that the monster was the victim and the hero was the murderer, every story you've ever been told comes into question. Every myth reveals its cruelty. Every statue commemorating violence makes you sick. But maybe that's exactly what we need. Maybe we need to be turned to stone for a moment, to stop, to freeze, to stand still and really look at what we've been celebrating, what we've been perpetuating, what we've been refusing to see. Maybe we need our own transformation, our own shedding of skin, our own confrontation with uncomfortable truths.
Medusa's still out there, you know? Not on some mythical island, but in every person who's been hurt and blamed for it. In every person who's made themselves hard because soft was too dangerous. In every person who looks at the world with eyes that see too much, who carries knowledge they wish they didn't have, who stands at a distance not because they want to be alone, but because they learned that closeness costs too much. She's in the rape survivor who's asked what she was wearing. She's in the abuse victim who's told she should have left sooner. She's in the refugee who's called a threat. She's in the whistleblower who's called a traitor. She's in anyone who's been punished for what was done to them, anyone who's been called a monster for refusing to be a victim anymore. And here's the truth they don't want you to know. She's not alone anymore. She's not exiled on an island surrounded by stone statues. She's surrounded by other survivors, other people who understand, other people who carry their own snakes, their own hard-won defenses, their own transformed selves. They're finding each other. They're telling their stories. They're refusing the scripts. They're rewriting the myths. And Perseus, with his borrowed sword and his divine intervention and his unearned glory, he's starting to look less like a hero and more like what he always was, a man who killed a woman because other men told him to and never asked why. So, what do we do with Medusa now? Do we keep her as a monster in our stories, a villain for new heroes to defeat? Do we make her a victim, frozen in her trauma, defined forever by what was done to her? Or do we let her be something more complex, more human, more real? A person who was hurt and survived, a person who was changed and lived with it, a person who was dangerous and vulnerable, powerful and wounded, isolated and longing for connection, a person who contained multitudes, like we all do, a person who deserved better than she got. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that she was turned into a monster. Maybe it's that she died believing that's all she was. Maybe it's that no one in the myth ever told her differently. Maybe it's that Perseus cut off her head without ever wondering what thoughts lived there, what dreams she'd had before the assault, what kind of person she might have been if the world had been kinder. Maybe it's that we've spent thousands of years looking at her image and never really seeing her, never asking what she would say if she could speak, never imagining her story from her perspective, never giving her the one thing every person deserves, the chance to be understood. So, here's what I'm offering tonight. Not a new myth to replace the old one, but a new way of looking. A choice to see Medusa not as a cautionary tale or a symbol or a monster or a martyr, but as a person, flawed and complex and worthy of compassion. Someone who suffered, someone who survived, someone who deserved to be more than a severed head on a hero's shield, someone who deserved to live. And maybe, if we can extend that grace to her, to a mythical woman who's been dead for thousands of years, maybe we can extend it to the living too, to the people around us who are carrying their own traumas, their own transformations, their own snakes. Maybe we can choose not to turn away. Maybe we can choose not to need them to be perfect victims or reformed monsters. Maybe we can just see them, really see them. And maybe in being seen, they won't have to turn anyone to stone. Maybe they can let their guard down. Maybe they can heal. Maybe we all can. That's the story they never told you about Medusa. Not the myth, but the truth beneath it. Not the monster, but the woman. Not the ending, but the possibility of what could have been different. The story where someone chose compassion over conquest. Where someone said you didn't deserve what happened to you. Where someone stayed even though her gaze was hard to meet. Where someone loved her not despite the snakes, but including them. Where someone saw past the defense mechanisms to the person underneath. Where someone chose her. Where she got to live. We can't rewrite ancient myths, but we can write new stories. We can be the people who choose differently, who break the cycles, who refuse to make monsters out of victims, who remember that everyone we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about, carrying pain we can't see, surviving things we can't imagine, who approach each other with tenderness instead of swords, who understand that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is not to slay the dragon, but to ask why it's breathing fire in the first place. Medusa's gaze still has power, not to turn us to stone, but to make us stop, to make us think, to make us question everything we thought we knew about heroes and monsters, about justice and revenge, about who deserves our compassion and who deserves our fear. Her story is a mirror, and in it we can see ourselves, not as we want to be, but as we are. not the myths we tell about ourselves, but the truth underneath. And the truth is this: we're all capable of being Perseus. We're all capable of accepting the narratives we're given, of following orders, of cutting off heads because someone in power told us to. We're all capable of using other people's trauma as weapons. We're all capable of building monuments to violence and calling it heroism. But we're also all capable of being different, of questioning, of choosing compassion, of seeing the humanity in people we've been taught to fear, of refusing to be heroes at the cost of someone else's life, of laying down our swords and walking away from glory if glory requires cruelty. That's the choice Medusa's story offers us every single day, not in ancient Greece, but right here, right now, in how we treat each other, in how we tell stories, in how we decide who matters and who doesn't. The myth is old, but the question is eternal. When faced with someone who's been transformed by pain, someone who's built defenses, someone who's hard to love because they've been hurt so badly, what will you choose? Will you see a monster that needs to be destroyed, or will you see a person who needs to be seen? Medusa's still waiting for an answer. We all are.